Good morning, screenspuds. Today I am doing a kind of controversial topic and something I wasn't aware was even going on. Uh, and I think most of you probably won't know, or some of you might, I don't know. I used to do a lot of reading the news, Fox News, ABC, all of them. Tried to keep abreast on what was going on, get a perspective from different uh, you know, from the Democrats, from the Republicans, from the conservatives, from the liberals, what each one's take was on something. Usually you can find a little truth in each. At least back then you could. Nowadays it seems like the liberal media has their agenda and they don't really care about putting any truth to it. Or in Trump's words, fake news. But, nowadays with two children, I don't usually have time to do that anymore. So I try to keep abreast as best as I can, but it's not always possible. It seems my older son Joel has woken up, so I'm going to put this on pause to let him out of his room. And my younger son Josiah is awake, so there may be some interruptions while I do that. All right, I'm back. Yes, I gave him a piece of a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and we'll see how that keeps him calm for a little bit. He seems like he's still a little bit tired, so we'll see. So the topic here is what are being called drug safe zones, which is basically a location where a person can come and legally inject themselves with illegal drugs, and they'll use the needles provided by the facility to do so. So the facility is going to provide them hygienic needles that are clean and supposedly safe, so that they can safely break the law using unsafe illegal drugs. Makes a lot of sense. I do have my laptop open ahead of me. That's where the glare on my glasses is from. I got a few notes to help keep me on point because this particular topic has me a little upset, to say the least. The benefit of this is that it's supposed to reduce fatalities from overdoses because there are medically trained staff on hand right there by them that are supervising them. And if they do overdose or have any complication, that medical staff can then save their lives with other drugs. If they just didn't do drugs in the first place, they wouldn't have the problem. And that's where, I kind of feel like that there's an issue with this whole concept because, a lot of people don't do things because it's not safe to. But then when you make it safer, more people start to do it because now there's a safe way to do it. You have people who don't do things that are wrong and unethical, not because it's wrong and unethical, but because it's not safe to do it. Kind of like people who, may want to hurt or kill someone they don't like, but they don't do it because they're afraid of getting in trouble with the law. They don't want to go to prison. They don't want the death penalty. So they hold themselves back. That's why we have harsh punishments. Sometimes it takes a harsh consequence to keep people in line with certain things. And I think illegal drugs is one of those things. Basically, the individual has immunity while they are inside the facility. While they are inside the facility, anything, the illegal drugs that they're taking while there, they cannot be arrested for, they cannot be taken to jail for it. They basically can break the law inside this facility and there's no consequence. Even if a police officer was inside there witnessing it, he wouldn't be able to arrest the individual. That is my cat. Applejack. Our son calls him Jack. He is rather interested in the window. Supposedly, in addition to reducing fatalities from drug overdoses, there's also the proposed benefit that they supply literature and other documentation to inform an individual of where they can go for rehabilitation or how they can get rehabilitation. And some of these facilities offer treatment. Only a fraction of people who get on drugs actually care about getting off them. Most drug addicts don't realize they're addicted, or even if they do, they don't realize how it's hurting their lives. They don't realize the health impacts, and even if they do, they don't care. It's, in many ways, it's kind of like me and food. I know a lot of what I eat isn't exactly healthy for me, but I still eat it because I like how it tastes. And that's how it's going to be with people who use drugs. You're going to have an influx of people who are using these drugs because now they have a safe way to do it. And only a fraction of them are going to realize how it's harming them and care enough to get off. When I used to live in Birmingham, I used to work for a hotel there that uh, I won't name just for the sake of what's in the story. We had an individual who lived in our parking basement of the hotel. He only wore garbage bags. He was on drugs. I know for a fact he had supplied drugs to a couple individuals. Whether he sold or not, I don't know if he just gave them out or what, but we had guests who admitted that they had gotten certain stuff from him. And, he didn't see anything wrong with his life. He slept in that parking garage, but he had a wife he could go home to. He could clean up and go home to his wife. She wanted him to come home, but he didn't see a problem with how he was living. He was perfectly fine. Wearing a garbage bag, doing drugs, completely unkept. No, he didn't wash himself, nothing like that. He didn't see a problem with that. And he had been like that for years. You would think a person, once they end up wearing a garbage bag as their sole source of clothing, not even underwear, you would think when you get to that point, you might realize that these drugs have had a negative impact on my life and change. But people who are addicted to drugs don't always recognize or aren't always willing to admit what the drugs are doing to them. Well, to continue on, there's some other names that these drug safe zones go by. They're not just called drug safe zones. One name they go by is supervised injection facilities. Kind of obvious by the name. Another name they go by is community health engagement locations. And by that name, you wouldn't expect that it's that kind of facility. You might just think it's some place where a community can come and get information or come to get, some medical assistance. You wouldn't think, oh, let's go to the community health engagement location and inject ourselves. You wouldn't expect to walk in and see 10 people sitting in chairs, doing heroin. And I think that's probably the reason for that name is, you could go into a location that's where the population is highly resistant to the idea of a supervised injection facility, propose it as a community health engagement location, be vague about what kind of health benefit is being supplied, and the community could just approve it because yes, we want more, community health. We want more medical facilities for individuals of lower income. And next thing you know, you have this facility across the street from where you live where heroin users are going. Another thing that they go by is Insight, INSITE as one word. The I and S are capitalized. And this seems to be more like a company name than a location name. But we'll get on to the whole company thing later on. The pushing for this is actually by what is known as the Drug Police Alliance, which is a big organization vehemently opposed to the drug on wars. It was founded by George Soros, Kevin Zeese, and Ethan Nadelman. And I know whenever people say, oh, George Soros is behind this, suddenly there's like a whole bunch of, oh, prove it, his name's behind a lot of things, he's involved in a lot of things, he's major activist with tons of money, and so his hands are in everything, it seems. And then, of course, there's some things that he is attributed to that he has nothing to do with, simply by people who oppose that particular item and oppose him and feel that attaching the two will garnish opposition towards it as well, or just assume he's involved in anything they don't like. But in this particular instance, he is involved. Even the DPA, the Drug Policy Alliance, admits that he was one of their founders. Ethan Nadelman is a well-known activist for the promotion of the legalization of marijuana and the decriminalization of it. All three oppose putting people in jail for using drugs. Don't worry, it's just a plastic toy. And all three oppose harsh sentences or punishment of any kind for drug users. So you can kind of get a good idea of, where the Drug Policy Alliance is coming from. Clearly, they don't see an issue with drugs. Clearly, this is more about making drug use more familiar, because when you see something a lot, it becomes familiar to you. And once something becomes familiar to a generation that opposes it, in the eyes of their children, it's always been that way. They don't know of a era when it wasn't that way. So for them, it becomes so familiar that it's really easy to push through the legalization of something in their mind. So the liberals have found that the best way to pass something that Americans don't want is by getting the Americans who don't want it to talk about it, getting them to see it a lot in movies, television, news, get it in front of their eyes as much as possible, in their ears as much as possible, because their children are going to be hearing it, their children are going to be seeing it. Get it mentioned in the schools, get it mentioned in the colleges. Get it heard so much that it becomes so familiar that the next generation doesn't remember an era without it, an era when it wasn't heard of or wasn't talked about much. Because to that younger generation, the older generation sounds a little weird for opposing it so much, because it's like, it's always been that way. Why do you have a problem with it? And that's the easiest way to get anything passed that is immoral and unethical, because that next generation is going to be less resistant. And even if they don't do it, the next generation definitely will. They did the same thing with the legalization of same-sex marriage. Our grandparents' generation opposed it so much that they fought against it when it came forward in legislation. And by the time my generation grew up, suddenly there were enough people willing to do it. It had become so commonplace. It was in movies, it was in television, it was in the news. And it just was so familiar that a lot of people, even those who didn't favor the lifestyle, were willing to support the legislation, because in their minds it had always been that way. They had literally been fooled into believing it was never illegal, and yet it had been illegal since the day of our founding fathers. There is controversy on a claim that they do make about the economical aspect of it. The company themselves claims that they save anywhere from 50% to 300% of every dollar that's invested into them for the government. So you spend, let's say, $1 on the facility. For every dollar on the facility, they claim that they're saving $1.50 to $4. In fact, one expert, Tony Clements, who's the health minister for the Canadian government, stated that the money would have actually been, that they had been investing, would have actually been better spent on treatment for these individuals rather than the facility itself. As far as any locations in the United States, from what I can tell, there aren't any publicly advertised locations in the United States. The DPA claims there aren't any whatsoever. Back in the 1980s, 1990s, there supposedly were some in the U.S. that were being operated illegally. They weren't sanctioned by any government. The notion that such facilities just stopped existing seems a little exaggerated to me, but even if we assume they don't, there's a lot of legality behind this. Law experts all pretty much agree, with few exceptions, that even if a state or city legalizes it with their own legislation, the facility and the legislation used to legalize the facility would actually be illegal, because the laws governing these illegal drugs are actually done at the federal level. Give me 1 second. Sorry about that. It seems both of my sons want to watch the guy on the lawnmower outside. We live in an apartment complex, so the yard's taken care of. But my older son didn't want to share his window. So I gave my younger son his spot at a different window, and he seems happy now. And he's sharing that spot with a cat. But to get back on topic, because these illegal drugs are regulated by the federal government, and they are illegal, a state or city facility that permits the use of illegal drugs would actually be in violation of federal law, which prohibits the use of illegal drugs. Makes perfect sense. And that's exactly how I think it should be fought, is more on the federal level. Let's really push that, cities and states don't have a right to pass laws that violate a federal law, especially a federal law that the majority of Americans definitely agree with. I do not think the majority of Americans support or promote heroin use or the legalization of such. Not sure how long my younger son's going to be happy now that my older son decided he likes his window. Okay, so moving on from there, there are some locations that are considering this would be Ithaca, New York. Their mayor's Vanton Merrick has been pushing for this. Fortunately, the local city's police chief and the state lawmakers of New York have been blocking his efforts, but New York is a fairly liberal state. I have lived in the state of New York. They did, elect Clinton after all. She was a representative of the state at one time, so it's not too much of a stretch to think that eventually those winds could change. So if you are a conservative or even a liberal who opposes the notion of someone doing heroin across the street from your house, might be a good idea to make sure your lawmakers know you support them blocking any legislation that would allow a drug safe zone. In Massachusetts, the state senator William Brownsberger introduced legislation to permit these throughout the state. Massachusetts currently has locations called Boston Healthcare, which provides medical monitoring for those who have taken the illegal drugs, and rescues them if they have overdose or there's a bad reaction or anything like that. They do not allow you to take the drug on site. Let's hope they actually are sticking with that. But that's a state senator who's actually trying to pass it in Massachusetts. So if you're in Massachusetts, you might want to make a few phone calls. Maybe vote for somebody else next time around. San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Portland and Seattle are all other locations that are also considering legislation to legalize these facilities. That's all my research was able to show, and I didn't do a whole lot of research on locations. Let me check my son real quick. Alright, I am back. This time I have Josiah in my hands because Joel has decided he's going to be aggressive with controlling all 3 windows. So, he is eating a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. I'll probably put this tip in another video sometime, but the best way to do the sandwiches for toddler or infant is to freeze the bread, then apply the peanut butter and the jelly. And it doesn't take too long for the bread itself to thaw, but you're going to want to apply the peanut butter and jelly while it's frozen. And then you just leave the sandwich out or put it in the fridge for a few minutes, let it thaw. And then I cut it into 6 pieces. I cut it in half and then each half into thirds. And it makes it very manageable for them to hold. I have a tendency to put a little too much jelly, but if you put the jelly real thin, they won't pull the bread apart like he has. Anyway, back onto the video. There really seems to be a trend nowadays in these safe zones. We created these safe cities for illegal immigrants, where even though federal law says it's illegal to be an illegal immigrant, and the federal government's going to come and arrest you and deport you in these locations, they won't report you to ICE, and in many cases they'll block ICE from coming to get you. Defiance by states and cities to our federal government. I very much liked what Trump said he was going to do in regards to negating funding to cities that act as safe cities for legal immigrants. However, I feel as if though he should have targeted more the state than the city. I think the state would have to apply pressure to the city to say, look, we're going to pass a statewide legislation that prohibits safe cities in our state, that no city in our state can defy ICE or our national immigration policies. And that's how I think it should have been. I don't think it would be very effective otherwise. But obviously if he did that, he'd receive a lot of backlash, because it would mean withholding funding for education and other emergency services. And I think in the end he probably would receive a lot more backlash than he would support. But I do think that it would have been the most effective way to do it. And sometimes you have to be willing to be the martyr to accomplish something that's right and good. But, these safe zones, we did it with illegal immigration. Now we have them trying to do it with illegal drugs. And it's like, where does this really end? What laws are we going to say are valid in our country? There shouldn't be such a thing as an exemption. There shouldn't be such a thing of it's illegal to do this except in this area. You can't murder somebody unless you're in this state. There shouldn't be, like slavery. It's illegal border to border all over in our country. We wouldn't want, some city saying, well, in our city, we are a slave-safe zone. You can have slaves here. We wouldn't want that. We shouldn't want that for heroin use or any narcotic use. We shouldn't want that for, immigrants that come here illegally. I mean, I love immigration. Immigration's a great thing. But there's a right way and a wrong way to do things. And people who are willing to break the law to get into our country are less likely to be willing to respect our laws while they're here. And I think, we really need to target going after illegal immigrants who have been violating our national laws. I mean, if we're going to sit here and continue with these safe zones, maybe we should let people start establishing their homes as tax safe zones. That anybody who lives in my home doesn't have to pay the federal income tax anymore. I mean, it's ridiculous to think that we're even allowing safe zones of any form. And I'm not sitting here, trying to promote the idea of not paying your taxes. I firmly believe as a believer that we are required by our Savior to obey the laws of the land, in so much as it is not immoral to our Savior. And taxes are not something that is immoral or unethical. But this whole safe zone thing, it has me upset to think that, my children could possibly grow up in a country where, it's not a thing of don't do drugs, but a thing of do drugs safely. It's kind of like, what happened with sexual immorality, where, 1 second. So they seem to disagree as to who should have the rocking chair. So I'm going to hold this one for a little bit again until he wants back down. But yeah, I mean, sexual immorality in our country used to be a thing of don't have sex before marriage. Don't have multiple sexual partners. And then it became have safe sex. And now we're doing that with drugs. Don't do drugs because they're unsafe. And now we're going to have these safe zones where it's going to be like, if you're going to do drugs, do it safely. And that's another thing that I didn't mention was the economic aspect of these locations. Several websites, several news organizations all admit that these locations often operate on a for-profit basis. I wasn't unable, with the limited research I tried to put into the profit aspect, to determine how much they make, but they're making money through a number of ways. And besides the fact that the city and state would be giving them funding, they also operate for profit with sales and everything. Many sites mention that some, not all, but some, do not allow the sale of the illegal drugs on site. The fact that only some don't allow it implies that some do allow it, which means that either the ones who do allow it are selling the illegal drugs themselves, or they're allowing drug dealers to come in and sell them. And that seems like a conflict. It's a conflict of interest to sell something and simultaneously tell people to stop buying it. And you don't go to Dairy Queen and hear the lady behind the counter saying, hey, we're doing 3 scoops for $1 today. Oh, and by the way, here's some literature on why you shouldn't eat ice cream every day, or why you shouldn't eat ice cream at all. Give me 1 second. That is my son Joel, and he seems to want me to come play with him. So I will be getting off this and cutting this video just a little bit short. Pretty much said all the points I was gonna say. But yeah, I mean, definitely take action against this. Make sure your state isn't considering it. Make sure your city isn't considering it. And do some research on it as well. I know since the 1980s, a lot of nations in Europe have been doing it, and the economic benefits are questionable. In 1 second. All right, so Joel has himself a peanut butter and jelly sandwich now. But yes, in Vancouver, British Columbia, which is the only location in North America that supposedly has such a facility, they were bragging that they had 0 fatalities from overdoses after the site was established. However, from the research that they did, I believe in 2016 or 2017, they found that fatalities from overdoses actually increased by 80 times between that year and the previous year. The reason that they were able to claim 0 fatalities and brag it was because the 0 fatalities actually occurred in the facility. It didn't actually reduce the number of fatalities in the community itself. And that was from, I believe, ABC or NBC News that I read that. So it's very important that we really fight against these locations. Even if they were effective at reducing fatalities, they will only be effective at increasing drug use. And we can't trust a facility that is going to be run for profit to run itself out of business by eliminating all its clients. It's just not going to happen. So thank you for watching this video. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. Subscribing is very important. It's the only way that I'm going to be able to access certain features with YouTube for editing videos and other things. And of course, comment. We'd love to have comments on our videos. So thank you very much for watching this video. Hope you enjoyed it.